Lease agreement. In Finland, renting an apartment always requires signing a written lease agreement. The agreement is signed after the tenant has viewed the apartment and expressed interest in renting the apartment under the terms of the lease agreement. If the lease agreement covers other facilities in addition to the apartment, such as a storage unit in the basement of the building, those should also be checked. Tenants should check that the address of the apartment is the same as the address stated in the lease agreement. Reserve enough time for carefully reading through the lease agreement together with the landlord before signing the agreement. The lease agreement contains many important sections. If something is unclear or you do not know what it means, ask the landlord. The written lease agreement becomes a legally binding document after it has been signed. Both parties will have their own copy of the lease agreement. The duration of the lease. Fixed-term lease agreement. Many landlords first make a fixed-term lease agreement for a certain period of time. The lease period is usually 1 year, and the tenant may not terminate the lease during this period even if they want to move out. In addition, the tenant may not lease the apartment again to another person. After the validity period of the fixed-term lease agreement has ended, the lease agreement will usually continue as a lease that is valid until further notice. Open-ended lease agreement. This lease agreement is valid until either the tenant or the landlord terminates it. The tenant and the landlord have their own notice periods. The tenant's notice period is until the end of the next whole calendar month. This means that when you terminate the lease agreement will terminate on the last day of the following month. When the landlord terminates the lease, they must give the tenant time to find a new home according to the duration of the lease. If the tenant has lived in the apartment for more than a year without causing any problems, the tenant will be given 6 months to find a new home and move out. If the tenant has lived in the apartment for less than a year, the notice period is 3 months. Living in the apartment without causing any problems means that the tenant has paid the rent on time, has taken good care of the apartment, and has not disturbed the building's other residents. The condition of the apartment at the beginning of the lease period. The tenant commits to renting the apartment in the condition that it was in when the lease agreement was signed. You should carefully inspect the apartment together with the landlord, record any defects and deficiencies, and agree in writing on the repair of those defects and deficiencies. The tenant is obligated to take good care of the apartment and its fixtures and fittings, such as cupboards and kitchen and bathroom furniture. The tenant may not make any changes to the apartment, for example by painting the walls, without asking for the landlord's permission first. The total cost of the rent. The rent does not usually include electricity, water, gas, internet, sauna, or laundry room fees, or the fee for renting a car parking spot. The lease agreement must clearly state what the rent includes and what other costs are incurred by, for example, using the building's laundry room. The tenant makes their own electricity and internet contracts. Rent increases and the date of rent payment. The rent may be increased, and the increases are calculated based on factors such as the increase in the general cost of living. This means that the rent can be increased once a year, for example. The lease agreement must state in writing what this increase is and when it will enter into force. The landlord must also notify the tenant of the new total sum of the rent. The date of rent payment is binding, and the entire rent must be paid into the rent payment account by that date. If possible, the tenant may seek to agree on setting the 5th day of the month as the date of rent payment, by which time the tenant's pay or various benefits have usually been paid into the tenant's account. Security deposit. The security deposit is usually a sum equivalent to 2 months of rent that is paid into a separate security deposit account at your bank. The security deposit is intended to protect the landlord, who can use part of it or the whole sum if the tenant damages the apartment. If the tenant lives in the apartment without causing any problems, they will get back the security deposit when they move out, as long as they have cleaned the apartment and returned all the keys to the apartment. The security deposit must be returned within a fixed period of time. It is a good idea to specify this time period in the lease agreement. If the tenant has not performed a move-out cleaning, the landlord will use part of the security deposit to pay for a move-out cleaning service. In some cases, Kela may pay social assistance to the landlord as part of the security deposit. In this case, the tenant will not get the security deposit back when moving out. Home insurance. The landlord may require the tenant to take out home insurance. In this case, the tenant must have valid home insurance for the entire duration of the lease. Having home insurance and separate liability insurance protects the tenant as they cover the damage that is caused to the tenant's own belongings and to the rental apartment in case of, for example, water damage, fire, or theft. The tenant is responsible for the apartment, which means that taking out home insurance is always a good idea. Online, you can find many insurance companies selling home insurance. Check their terms and conditions and choose the option that suits you best. In some cases, Kela may pay part of the home insurance.